So we've all heard a lot today about the various challenges around the future of work, and each of you come at the future of work with a unique perspective from government, from Indigenous communities, and at both the provincial and the territorial level. So maybe, Mark, if we could start with you. From the perspective of where you sit in the government of Alberta, what are the big challenges you see in the future of work?
Sure. Well, one thing I was struck by today is I think if this conference had been held 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been about the rise of the robots and the disappearance of work. And I think that idea seems to have faded somewhat. I think now we're into a long-term grind. We're not into the immediate cessation of whole categories of work like long-term trucking. We're into 20 or 30 years of transition, and how do we deal with that with policies that were really designed for another generation? I mean, certainly the challenges that we're facing in Alberta is that even as we've come out of the recession, there are still categories, particularly young males, where employment is still below the level at the trough of the recession. Whereas employment among women, employment among people over 25, employment in Edmonton has fully recovered, but there are still some subcategories that are persistent unemployment, and how do we deal with those challenges? Where these are people who were 10 years ago were able to come out of high school straight into jobs paying six figures, and now have been unemployed for 2-3 years with no immediate prospect of getting back to work. So that's how do we deal with those kind of stubborn challenges?
Yes, and that segmentation I think we've touched on in several conversations. It's this whole linear, there's one model that fits all and it will solve everything. Doesn't seem to be answered, and that's a great practical example. Laura Lee, maybe we could jump over to you as we go almost coast to coast in terms of a provincial perspective. In Nova Scotia, what are you seeing in terms of your role as those challenges around the future of work?
Well, first of all, what a compelling day, and all of the panels and speakers that have gone before us it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose when you're listening to the perspectives of others and some of the brilliance that we have heard here today. I don't think I'm going to pull back the curtain on anything that really hasn't been discussed today, but when I think about it from our perspective in Nova Scotia, and I don't mean to get really pedestrian about it, but it is really for me about how does it work? What differences can we make on the ground with our thinking? And how can we use some of the information and some of the items that we've heard here today to really help inform our discussions around the future of work? And I see it in 2 phases. I think there is an urgent part of this conversation, and then I think there's an emergent part of this conversation. And let me just tell you what I mean at the risk of taking up too much time. But the urgent part is what we're seeing in our province and in our region right now. So for example, we have the dubious distinction in Nova Scotia of having the oldest population in the country. Armin just talked about that a few moments ago, but Nova Scotia is even older than the national average. And so there is a situation with a contracting workforce as people are aging out, and how do we turn that what might seem like a disadvantage into an advantage? How can we use our policy discussions to change the face of that reality for us? And so just to give you an example, we have a strategy called SHIFT, which really looks at our aging population as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Some of our older Nova Scotians who still want to be engaged in work, they'll take the job at Tim Hortons because they just want to get out and socialize a bit. They'll start up their own business. They will do things that keep them invested in their communities that maybe some of our younger workers don't want to do. So that's an advantage that we might have if we can play our cards the right way and convene the right conversations. And then if I look at the emergent, it is the long game. So how do we convene? I think government it really plays the role of convener in a lot of this. How do we convene the right conversations with the right actors to look at the long game? And so we've heard today how important it is to get the policy intentions right around early learning, to set those young people up right from the time they come out so that they're coding in school and that they're going to university and they're getting involved in sandboxes and incubators, and then they're investing in their own startups so that we have opportunities that give us a long game that can help people be resilient and sustain themselves in our own area. So I don't want to take up all the air, but these are some of the things that I think about when I hear the future of work conversation. I'll just add one more thing. We also have the distinction in this country for decades of having amongst the highest unemployment rates, the lowest employment rates, and being at the bottom of the pack when it comes to economic performance. And I'm here to say that our employment rate is the highest right now that it has been in 40 years. Our unemployment right now is at the lowest that it's been in 40 years. And for the last 3 years, our outmigration is trending in the opposite direction. And in fact, we're in the positive territory now. So we're quite excited about the conversation and the future of work. Because we haven't had a lot of work in our province. So to say that we're now, instead of looking for jobs for people, we're looking for people for jobs, that's a great opportunity for us.
That's a fantastic term to end it on, and I think there's been a couple of discussions earlier around that, actually looking for people for jobs. I think the GM study or the GM case study was a great one. But you brought up, again, that segment of the population, particularly the older population. I know there are a few fans of the work of Linda Grattan in this room who's talked about that older population. Actually, it's an important segment. It's interesting to see that difference as we move west to east from a very specific younger population to a very specific older population. Maybe that's a good jumping off point, Michael, to jump in for a perspective around Indigenous communities. And you and I had this conversation about potential opportunities as well in this space.
Yeah, is this on?
Yeah.
All right, sorry. I was in the back, it was on, and I was looking for a powder room because I see on TV our faces shine. You know, like, I don't want to look like I just ate a bucket of chicken.
It's a healthy glow.
You know,
At least it's not the top of your head that's shining.
yeah, I'm privileged to partake and listen in a lot of these conferences across the country in different sectors and subsectors. And I always like the diversity of thought and experience. And that diversity actually exists within Indigenous communities. I mean, there's 1.6 million self-identified Indigenous people. I think 56% of them is urban-based, ranging from Winnipeg from 91,000 to the 15,000 at Thunder Bay, Halifax. So there's the urban, and then there's the rural. And then when you look at what Stats Can did in 2016, the rural remote, they're the most porous, right? And yet they have the most potential around resource development. And so when I work across the country, and the chiefs or the political territorial organizations that's trying to deal with the governments in their respective jurisdictions are coming up with policy advice, and that's where I think I think the phrase today was called a hidden default of gender bias. So I would say it was the hidden default of public policy. Right, the thought that everything was designed for mainstream industries and stuff. So the turning the lens on, the public policy lens to those policymakers and trying to develop something that public policy programs that facilitate, not frustrate, Indigenous economic development and startup and training, because every jurisdiction is different. I've worked in Nova Scotia recently with the forestry sector out at Calgary and Vancouver and remote north in Ontario, and every government has their impediments, and sometimes it's not intentional. It was designed for something else, not Indigenous communities trying to get involved in the economy. I think the other phrase I caught was the contrarian insights, and I actually agree that certain jobs, traditional old economy jobs, they're not all disappearing. So I'm a chairman of an Indigenous aviation company. And so it actually, I would call it essential service for the remote north, right? Because yet there's pilots, aviation engineers, customer service, charter agents, there's a whole roster of occupations associated just with that little company servicing communities in the north. I look at James Bay, Five Nations Transmission Company. that provides essential service power, and it too has electrical engineers and linesmen and all that kind of stuff, just providing the essential service that we take for granted here in the major centers. So those traditional jobs, I don't think, are disappearing. I mean, you look at the airport here, there's what, 101,000 people working there, 49,000 direct jobs at Toronto Pearson Airport. I think it was 33 or whatever, 32,000 indirect and the rest induced. Like, that's not disappearing. I fly a lot. But to me, those are essential, those traditional jobs. And I think, the Indigenous folks, the up and coming, like my kids' age, they're pretty tech savvy, and I think that they'll find their space in the innovations, and those that gravitate to sort of the urban center opportunities, they'll just go there on their own.
I think that's a good reminder that we shouldn't forget that some of those traditional jobs are still going to be there, and as we develop particularly our rural and remote communities, that there is going to be a requirement for that. So as we push towards the future of work, we can't forget that there are still basic requirements that need to be met everywhere else. That's certainly a great point. And Graham, of course, in your role, you have a much broader overview as you look across things in Canada, and I'm sure as you've been getting to grips with developments at ESDC, you have a view in terms of some of those challenges that we face in the future of work.
So we're preparing for a democratic event in the fall. And in doing that transition, it's a real opportunity for the public service to do that medium-term planning. So since the conference is about future of work, maybe I could focus not on the things that the labor shortage issues that the government will confront right out of the gate. And this is one of the biggest changes as a fellow Blue Noser in my lifetime, is seeing labor shortages coast to coast to coast, equally present in rural and urban communities. This is every political actor of every stripe will be focused on this. Let me not focus on the immediate issues, but on that medium-term planning, that future of work. And three observations that I think will help to color the transition advice we give. The first one will maybe create a bit of controversy, but it's that, to say the least, there's a wide band of uncertainty around how quickly the change is going to take. And I would say a bigger band of uncertainty than in other areas of public policy where we're projecting how quickly things are going to adjust. So I'd call this it's from the OECD to Osborne kind of thesis, which is within normal patterns of disruption to radical change that we'll be unable to manage. I remember in university reading Rifkin's End of Work and was looking forward to figuring out how to spend my labor, my huge leisure surplus that I was going to deal with. I don't know where that is, or my jet car that I was supposed to have by now too. I will point out in terms of the statistics on non-standard work that the subcomponents are obviously part-time, self-employed, and temporary. 1997, that was 38.1% of the workforce. 10 years later, 2007, it was 37.2%. And 10 years later, it's in 2017, 37.1%. Now, we can debate the underlying decomposition of that. We can debate labor stagnation, but we don't have an evidence base on which to brief ministers that there has been a radical shift yet. But I think we have lots of evidence that it could move in a disruptive fashion. Hard to know when, and certainly, and that was one of the pieces I really took away from Warren and others, was the growing fear of disruption that's present. And I will say we had the G7 labor and employment ministers a couple weeks ago in Paris, and this was top of mind for all, even though all have very different situations in terms of level of unemployment, this sort of disruption, where things are going. So the first piece would be there's a really wide band of uncertainty here in how this is going to develop. Second piece would be companies can afford to bet on certain scenarios, and if it doesn't work out, we have market mechanisms that deal with that. Governments can't do that. We've got to be available as last resort for multiple scenarios. So my second plea is we have to be preparing for all of the scenarios. So what have we done? We use Policy Horizons, which is our foresight expertise in the federal government, to work out two of the more extreme scenarios of disruption. And they've now published that work. But what we've been doing internally is stress testing, much like we do in the financial sector, against extreme scenarios. We've been stress testing our policy instruments against those more extreme disruption scenarios in areas of skills, safety net, labor policy, and economic migration, to name a few. And what we're really trying to test here is how adequate is the toolkit we have now. I'm not as worried if you have the right tools, but you'd have to scale them. Those are relatively easy decisions to take in a crisis. I'm much more worried about if you get in an acceleration scenario and you have to invent new tools at the same time as scaling them. That's when we tend to have big public policy failures. So to give an example of one of those areas, and Karen highlighted it, if you look at skills, one of the areas we stress tested where we feel there are real vulnerabilities is, well, on OECD standards, we're among the best in preparing people for work and pretty strong in dealing with people when they exit work to get them back into work. That middle piece of continuous upskilling while you're employed, that is not an area where we are comparatively as strong, and not an area where employer expenses or employer expenditures are particularly strong. And so that's an example of one of those areas where we really think we're going to have to focus, because we don't have great instruments now that will easily scale that. So what do you do with these areas when you stress test and you realize there are challenges, but you don't yet have a business case on the radical shift has already taken place and we have to move? You experiment, although I must say some of these experiments are at a pretty big scale. So let me just highlight a few of them. The Canada training benefit is a very significant step. If you think of training traditionally in the country, it's been done with federal transfers to provinces, transfers to training organizations, by businesses, by unions. But we haven't had a focus on directly funding individuals to be able to determine what to do in the training. And in part, that was based on the notion that employers would have a better handle on what they needed. So the training benefit, I think, is quite, and it's not a trivial experiment. It's $1.7 billion over the next 5 years, an estimated 600,000 Canadians to take advantage of it, providing time, money, and permission to be able to take the training. The Skills Center, I think, another area that highlights this. Experimentation in terms of what works, innovation, measurement, and as Gladys said, our big challenge is adoption, which we haven't had always a great take-up, so that's a real focus. On work-integrated learning, we experimented first in STEM. That's now been expanded to all disciplines. Again, big investment, $630 million over 5 years. And then Sunil has, I haven't seen it yet, but has or is close to submitting the report on the independent panel for federal labor standards. So there's an experimentation effort. If I could just close with 3 areas I think we should consider a very high degree of difficulty, but I think we're going to have to crack these nuts if we're going to be successful. I mentioned the training benefit, and there are other countries that have experimented in this. The easy pieces on that are giving people time, money, and permission in terms of labor protection. There are 2 pieces that are very hard there I want to drill down on. One is volition. So Singapore and France have observed we're further along than us, and the take-up has not been what you would expect. And it's a combination of factors, including often the last training opportunity people left, they were very happy to leave and not really keen to get back. Practical issues like having to do things on weekends with their family. Or what John was talking about, this need to move from training maybe towards innovation and new knowledge creation as something that's more exciting. So this volition piece is important. But the other, to go to something Sarah talked about, is customization. People are going to need the kind of TripAdvisor of training, but it's going to have to be hyper-customized to their needs. And that sounds really easy to do, because people have talked about a guidance counselor for life. I don't know if you remember your guidance counselor. I remember mine, because we had to go. So they said, Queen Elizabeth High School, Halifax. So their advice was, you should think about going to university. Like, that was the briefing. But then we had a really fancy tool, and it was a computerized tool where you inputted what your interests were, and it outputted an effort, what you suggested. So I inputted all the things that would require me to make the least amount of effort and get the highest amount of salary at the earliest time. And the conclusion, by the way, was oyster farmer. But that I think is going to be an incredibly important piece, tailored to local labor market conditions, to your unique circumstances. The Australians are trying this with something called JEDI. So those are two very tough nuts to crack. The third one's integration. People have talked about it. How do we replicate the Oshawa experience in peacetime?
Thank you very much, Graham. And for me, the real essence of what you're doing, which I think is going to help set us up in a better state, is experimentation. I think too often we've thought of government as this monolith that it's very difficult to turn that ship, and it takes a very long time. But you're trying to maneuver that very quickly, and you're deploying the little tugboats very quickly and deciding which ones you're going to follow. I think that's an important example to set in here. We talked about challenges of some of those specific segments, but we need to learn how to do this in different ways. So maybe that's a good point to segue into this, the kind of the meat of today. I'm going to unashamedly use the four of you as distillers. So you're my new distillery brand, and that distillation is on what we've heard over the course of today. There's been a lot to take in, but given your backgrounds and given what you do, from everything you've heard today, what would be the 2 or 3 big things, and by this I don't mean just policy, just 2 or 3 big actions, things we must and should do now, from your perspective, from what you've heard today. Laura Lee, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. Wow, only 2 or 3. Look, I would say that all of what was discussed today, I have been in plenty of conversations about them. But I think the ones that really stood out for me include that we really have to pay attention to the systems. And systems thinking is more important than just being able to see the systems, but we have to see how they interface. We have to recognize systemic barriers early. We have to have honest conversations about how to remove those barriers for success. And I think we have to understand that systems are not stagnant, they move. And we have to be nimble enough and agile enough to keep up with them. And challenging governments to be part of that agility, I think, is really important. Because while we all have, I think, the desire, keeping that pressure on by those of you who are in the public sector, those of you who are in social enterprise, academia, all of you play a very important role in that for us. The second thing I think is critical is being innovative and creative. And we heard about, this morning we heard about, where does our creativity go when you're a child? It's, we're inquisitive and we're curious. And I don't take that lightly. I think that in our province, we're working on what we call an innovation ecosystem. And we have to create the conditions where innovation is not something that is novel, but it becomes part of what we do all the time. I think what GM did with its problem was very innovative and creative when all of those minds came together and were determined to come up with a solution. And I guess the last thing I would say that's on my mind all the time, and it actually is the cornerstone of our strategic plan in Nova Scotia, is inclusive economic growth. And on 2 fronts. One is, how can we ensure that it isn't just the big multinationals that come in and keep getting rich? How can all of our citizens see themselves in the prospect of prosperity and the prospect of having, a house, a job, a friend, and live in a community? So these things are very important. And the other part of that is, how can Nova Scotia and the Atlantic region recognize its part in the inclusive economic growth of this country? What are the kinds of advantages we can bring to the table? We're not going to compete for the Google head office, but we have an ocean supercluster, and we should be drilling down and doubling down on that, working with Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick to capitalize on what our competitive advantages are so that we can contribute to this great nation in the same way that Alberta does with its oil and gas. So I would say those things are my takeaways from today.
Fantastic. I think that innovative and creative ability, you're not only talking about embedding that in people, but you're talking about understanding the system's flexible. So it's embedding that in government too. I think that's a hard action, but one we need to take. Michael, what are your thoughts, having heard everything today, in terms of actions we need to take?
Yeah, there's a lot of thoughts, but I think the Deputy Grand Chief premise around reestablishing governance, reinstituting their cultural practices, histories, and identities. So that's happening across Canada in different ways, and governments are listening. So there's the Aboriginal Educational Institutes. I actually agree that colleges do compete, and because they've been in that space longer than the Aboriginal Education Institute, they're the first one. The industry goes there first, and they got sort of a connection or a nexus with that sort of region, sub-region, and have industry players as councils, committees, etc. So I think if and I don't know how much, I didn't hear industry associations here. Like I don't know how many, if there are industry. So I sit on the board of the Prospectors Development Association of Canada, and we have international mining and junior exploration companies, 8,000 members, and I think about the forestry associations, the mining association, the pipeline association, like the people that actually that is the economy. And actually creating jobs, and as an employer, I remember when I first started off just trying to create one job, not my job, one job. As a young man, it was not easy creating one job, and even with an enabling programs out there around training and stuff, and trying to create that line of sight from training to an actual job. Is a challenge, and I find that industry associations and their members have a lot of experience with that in the resource development sectors, and it takes an exquisite collaboration with the training, with the agencies involved, and the supports, and the communities, and the companies in that. So there's lessons to be learned there across Canada with the industry associations for everybody. I think the other, so the Aboriginal Education Institute is very important, and as they embark on their journey towards self-government and helping create more professionals for those essential services that they're providing on reserve. And I think the other piece the Deputy Grand Chief was talking about was industry partners, right? And so like Bruce Power, as a leadership move, they decided that under the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, they decided to become PAR certified, Progressive Aboriginal Relations. And not only did they decide that, but they told all their suppliers, you got to be PAR certified, right? So 40 plus of their main suppliers suddenly are trying to get certified under the Progressive Aboriginal Relations, and suddenly they're forced to now engage the communities and actually learn about the histories and actually do the recruitment and training to participate in that local economy. So I think there's work, and I think the other one is probably procurement. They have a procurement strategy for Aboriginal business in Canada. It's pretty weak, in my opinion. I think they're reviewing it, if I'm not mistaken. But procurement to enable Aboriginal business to grow and actually hire more.
I thought that's a very powerful statement that you and the Deputy Grand Chief made around partnerships. I think we've heard that time and time again around the future of work. None of us are set up to do this alone. Not educational institutions, not government, not individuals, not the private sector.
I just one last point. I think it's an important one. So there's that messy middle, right? And a lot of the First Nations have nonprofit corporations, and they're now moving, some pretty sophisticated commercial enterprises with limited partnerships and income trusts. But there's now this, this social enterprise space. I think that's a different set of values. When they say that, work matters, and there's a social value. I think there's a trend out there that First Nations are looking at, this social enterprise space that can create training and employment opportunities.
And for those who are unaware, there's a fantastic example of that if you watch the videos from our Growth Summit earlier this year of some amazing social entrepreneurship happening with Indigenous communities. Graham, your thoughts in terms of what do we got to do?
That was like a setup on social enterprise that I'm going to have to resist, although we're just out this month with our investment and readiness stream to really get this launched. I laid out before the things that we've been working on and what I heard that reinforced it. Let me give you 3 things that have nudged me to I think, go back and rethink or reflect. So the 3 that surprised me a bit were the populism, nativism point, and the risk that if we can't find ways to intelligently fill the space, it may be unintelligently filled, so that we don't necessarily have the luxury of time, given the anxiety people are feeling, even if the evidence is not yet as strong on the disruption. The second one, I think, over and over in different ways, the reinforcement of this paradox between record low unemployment and high levels of anxiety about whether people are going to have jobs. And that human anxiety and how we work through that human anxiety and those dimensions, I think, are going to be really critical. And the last one is I think riffing off the last panel, you have a job, it's fine, like we've done our work. This notion of quality of work, how we measure quality of work, how we have policies that are designed to optimize around quality of work, that's a really tricky dimension, but I think one we're really going to have to think about.
Yeah, I think Oren really struck a chord with a lot of people around talking about that dignity of work, but it did appear in other panels as well where people talked about that gap and whether it's artificial because you're not paying enough and it's not really rewarding work. Mark, the last word to you.
Right. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't reinforce that I think there are some things that we have to do as a country and as jurisdictions to create jobs, and there are things that this populist mood sometimes militates against. But I think reducing corporate taxes when we're in an uncompetitive environment with the United States after their corporate tax cut, I think is something that we have to think about. Immigration is a huge opportunity to bring in highly skilled entrepreneurial people from around the world, and should be seen as a net addition, right? And in this kind of an atmosphere, there's a resistance to that, but we all know that actually, in the long run, is one of the most important contributors to job creation. But one thing that's really struck me from this day is that our social and economic and educational systems are really designed for a model where people would go through some form of post-secondary education, get into a job, maybe go through a couple of transitions in their life, and then retire, and there'd be a social benefit system to take care of them. That narrative no longer exists. People are working while they're going to school. They're going to school while they're working. They're retired but still working. And we need to have social systems that are just as flexible as the lives that people are living. And I think really it's designing those social systems to the reality of the economy that we're living in is really essential. And if I could just say one other thing, just picking up on some of the points Michael was making, coming from a resource-intensive province, I don't think there'll be any major resource projects in this country that go forward without, at a minimum, Indigenous benefits agreements, probably as a default, some form of Indigenous equity participation, and in some cases, full Indigenous ownership. And that will shape employment opportunities. That is one of our youngest population centers in the country, and that will shape the future of Indigenous unemployment. And that's no longer, I think, something that can be seen as a side issue to be considered. It's a large and growing part of our population, especially in Western Canada, and it is located exactly where our resource-intensive industries are located.
That's a fantastic point, I think, to round things up. We've actually come full circle, and almost everyone's touched on it, whether it's in different groups or Indigenous communities. It's that inclusivity. The Chief Security Officer of Cisco said on a podcast, forget all of the bits and pieces about why it's good to have diversity. Diversity simply works because you're facing a challenging environment. If you don't have a range of ideas, you're sunk. And all of you in some way or another have come back to that and how we include people, how we make sure all of the groups have their needs met, and how we're flexibly meeting those needs going forward. For your distillation today, I wish I could provide you all with a whiskey to go with it, but I think that was a great vintage. Thank you very much.